Hey, what's up, boxing fans? I'm doing a little response to Blood Boxing's video about the great heavyweights. He gave his top five, so it's hard for me to narrow down top five. It's hard to rate heavyweights, rate any. Um, it's hard to compare boxers from different eras. Like Rocky Marciano. He retired undefeated, virtually knocked out everyone he faced. Um, he was the man in his era. But you compare it. How are you going to compare that? Fought most of his fights, at less than cruiserweight. 188, 190, was the heaviest, I think. 192 or 3. Uh, so, he wouldn't even be a heavyweight today. So you have to consider that. No matter how great a fighter is, someone giving away 70 or 80 pounds is going to cost sooner or later. So how do you compare that? So the only thing you can do is compare their record in the era when they fought, how they done, and plus, the fighters. I know some, especially young boxing fans, they watch some of these old tapes and they don't really do the fighters justice in that era. They're so used to seeing steroid enhanced bodies, and we have so much more information on nutrition, training, so much more. The fighters and athletes today have so many advantages over the athletes of yesterday. But if those athletes had the same training information and equipment that today's athletes had, they'd be just as effective, if not more. The thing about the older athletes, a lot of them fought for the love of the game. You hear that a lot. It's a cliche, but it's the truth. Today's athletes, some do, but money, in my estimation, has pretty much ruined professional sports. I still enjoy sports, but I still think if you take a team, you take an all-star team in any sport from the 70s, 60s, and throw them in against today's, they may look outgunned, outmanned physically, but the heart, the toughness, you can't measure that. You can't measure that with a stopwatch. You can't measure that, and they played sometimes, both sides. But anyway, I'm getting completely out of sports here. I don't want to do that. I want to get boxing. But anyway, I'm just saying it's hard to compare eras and fighters. And when you're talking greatest heavyweights, there's so many. It's hard to narrow it down to the top 10 or 20 even, much less 5. But you have somebody like Tyson, who was a beast, as Blood Boxing talks about. The prime pre-prison Tyson. He has to be mentioned, in the top 10 and maybe the top 5. Now, Blood Boxing says he thinks he could beat any heavyweight. Yeah, potentially with his punch he could. I don't think he would beat a prime Ali or a prime Holmes. That's my opinion. I just think their jab and the boxing ability. Tough boxers with a good chin always gave Tyson trouble. And a good jab. And both of those guys, they were the master of the jab. And so I think he would struggle against those type fighters, but throw him in with someone that is going to stand and trade, he would have the puncher's chance. And he was an awesome force. But I guess if I had to name 5, number 5, I would put Rocky Marciano instead of Dempsey, simply because how can you argue with undefeated and knocking out almost every opponent you faced? But he wouldn't even be a heavyweight today, as I said. He wasn't a great defensive fighter. He cut easily, which I think fighters like Ali or Holmes, or like I said, fighters with a good jab, tend to inflict a lot of cuts on their opponents. So you'd have to throw that in, but he always, got the job done. Back then they didn't stop fights as quick as they do today. But I just think you have to have Marciano there, just for the simple fact the guy retired undefeated. But I think the level of competition that he fought in post-war was not quite what Ali fought in, or even maybe Joe Louis. But you can't take anything away from The Rock, man. I mean, I have to have him at number 5. Just undefeated, and mean, you just can't argue with that, really. Number 4, I'll probably go Jack Johnson. Um, he was way ahead of his time, not only in boxing, but he pushed the envelope, and he did things for an African American that people were getting killed for, and he pushed it, and he didn't give a damn, and I like that about him. And he was a slick fighter. He toyed with opponents. He was so good he could toy with the best, and would probably be a tough match for anyone. But I'll put him at number 4. Number 3, one of my favorite all-time fighters, is I have Larry Holmes. Some people might think that's too high, but I remember watching Larry Holmes, man. It was beautiful to watch him. His jab was unlike any other jab. There's other fighters with good jabs. Ali had a good jab, great jab. Holmes' jab was like a piston, man. It inflicted damage. He could knock you down with his jab. His jab wasn't just to control tempo. It wasn't just a rangefinder. He could control a fight with his jab, and it was powerful and set up the monster right cross. And I'm talking his regular jab. I'm not talking a lot of times Larry Holmes would get someone hurt. If you watch the old fights, he would hold his left hand and use it as a rangefinder, just hold it out there to set up the right cross. And I thought, to me, he was at his best. I'm not talking, he was 38 or whatever when Tyson knocked him out, but his chin was amazing in his prime, and his jab, there's very few fighters I think could beat Larry Holmes in his prime. Very few. Number 2, I have Joe Louis. He's the classic boxer puncher. He's known for his punch. Some people say outside of Foreman and Shaver's probably the hardest puncher ever. That's something you can't prove, but he was devastating. And he could outbox you though, and he had the subtle defensive moves. Wasn't a flashy defensive fighter like Ali or someone that used a lot of movement, but he did subtle moves, sort of like a James Toney does to a lesser extent today, or in his prime. Bernard Hopkins knew how to roll with the punch, use the shoulder, and he was tough, and he was the total package, man, in his prime, and got a raw deal all the way around. So that leaves number 1. That's obvious. It's Muhammad Ali. I see some people saying Ali's not the greatest, man. That's blasphemy to me. Ali in his prime, he had, probably one of the best chins in history. And like Blood Boxing said, in the 60s, he was just an athletic machine. He was just too fast, too good, period. Just too fast. He just dazzled opponents. They were completely dazzled, and they had no answer. In the 70s, he had slowed down. He wasn't dancing a lot. He learned to use his brain instead of the physical power. And the 70s, if you want to watch a fighter, use every trick in the book. Use every little tactical advantage to win fights. That was Ali. He was great at analyzing his opponent and knowing their weakness. How many people could stand there and let George Foreman well away on their body, man? That speaks volumes about his toughness, his chin. His toughness is never talked about because of his flash, and he talked about being pretty, and a lot of people resented that back in the day, because I remember arguing with people over and over. They thought he was too cocky, but people overlook his toughness. One of the toughest guys ever. And the chin, along with the jab, the speed, everything. He was just a total package, man. Never be another. That's my top 5 heavyweights. I'll see you later.